the GSSB, held on 11 April 2018. This meeting is being hosted from Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Please note that this public GSSB meetings are being recorded and that you can find the audio recording on the GSSB webpage along with the high-level summaries of previous GSSB meetings. Present from the GRI Secretariat today are Bastian Buck, Director Standards Division, Laura Espinach, Senior Manager Standards, Anna Kratova, Manager Standards, and Tina Nubo-Jensen, Senior Coordinator Governance Relations. We will now start with a roll call. Attila Yelikaya.
Present.
Thank you. Dwight Justice.
Present.
Thank you. Evan Harvey.
Present.
Thank you. Julia Wilson.
Present.
Jürgen Buxbaum.
Present.
Kent Swift.
I'm present.
Michelle Washer.
Present.
Nandkumar Vadakipath.
Present.
Robin Leeson.
Present.
Salama Pioli.
I'm present.
Julie Moe. Vincent Kong.
Present.
And GSSB Chair Judy Kuszewski.
Present.
Thank you, everybody. GSSB member Kirsten Margret Hoovey sends her apologies. I will now hand to the Chair Judy Kuszewski to open the meeting.
Thank you very much, Gillian. Good morning and welcome to all members, especially to Kent Swift, who I believe has gotten up exceedingly early in the morning to be with us down the line. As Gillian mentioned, Kirsten Hoovey is joining us tomorrow. She's not going to be here today, but she'll be here for tomorrow's meeting. Could I first of all draw your attention to just a few slight changes in the agenda? You'll have a freshly printed copy at your place. We've just changed the order of a few things, and this is essentially to allow us to get through some of the approvals process in a nice orderly fashion. Bastian and I are of the opinion that we will probably make up a little bit of extra time this morning. And if we are successful in doing that, then we will move item 1.5, which is the approval of the GRI 403 Occupational Health and Safety before lunch, and then have our lunch break, and then carry on as normal afterwards. Otherwise, I think it's just it's the same agenda. It's just a slightly different order of a few things. Does anyone have any questions or comments about the agenda before we get into things? No. So we have, as I say, we have a few items to be approving today, and because of that, we have due process that comes into play here. I have a specific form of wording that we need to use when we are approving items. So if things sound a bit familiar at various times, it's because they are, and we are using that for the benefit of our due process and documenting our approvals procedures. Shall we take a look at the agenda then? If we've got a few slides, I think, on the agenda. Should we take a look at that? Okay, so we're going to start with, once we're done here, we'll approve the summary of our March 22nd virtual meeting. We then will have an update from Bastian about the goings-on at the Standards Division generally and the status of our work plan. We then go into the FAQ discussion. As you know, we have had we've had some questions that come in on the FAQ that we would like to update, and that's been part of our discussion for a little while, and we will complete that process this morning. We'll then have a short break. Our first formal approval under due process has to do, yes, pardon? Oh, beg your pardon, has to do with the a standard interpretation for making a GRI referenced claim, and then occupational health and safety GRI 403, followed by lunch. Hopefully, if we stick to the timing that we expect, we will be able to. After lunch, we'll be looking at GRI 303, water and effluents, which takes a little bit more explanation than the OH&S standard does, so we keep that one for after lunch. We'll then be joined over the speakerphone by Helena Barton, who is the chair of the Independent Appointments Committee, and she will be talking us through their process for filling vacancies on the GSSB in the months to come. We'll then have another break and have a review of the sector program, which we now have pilot funding to get started on. So Bastian will tell us about what that looks like. And then we'll close the public meeting, and we will have a few informational private sessions after the close of the public meeting. I might just save this until tomorrow, the review of tomorrow's agenda, unless anyone has any sort of pressing questions right now about tomorrow's agenda, because obviously things might change over the course of today. So we might take a look at this again later on this afternoon. So unless there are any questions about the agenda for the next 2 days, I'd like to move now to the approval of the summary of our March 22nd meeting. Have we received any comments or edits from any members, Bastian?
No comments received.
Do any members have any comments now? Hearing none, I think we will take it as read that that is approved. And then I'm going to turn it over to Bastian to give us an update from the Standards Division.
Thank you, Judy, and also welcome to me, to all the members. I will spend a couple of minutes now to update you on the Standards Division activities that are not covered in detail in the coming sessions during the 2 days, but also give you a bit of the context in which we are operating, and importantly, that has always been a reference to the uptake and the usage of our core product, the GRI standards. And this is where I want to start today, to give you an update on the downloads and users of the GRI standards. This is data that is covering basically the time frame from the launch of the standards in 2016 till end of February this year. And what we're looking at the moment is that we see continued interest in our core product. I think that is a very important finding from the statistics. We had more than 170,000 downloads of the GRI standards since we have launched them. We have more than 50,000 unique users, so individuals that have downloaded GRI standards. The most interesting part of that is that there are more than 48,000 new users of the standards, and or new contacts basically, that GRI was before the launch of the standards not aware of, meaning that we have contact information of those that have downloaded the information and they were not part of our contact database at GRI, which enables us, at least for those that have granted permission to do that, to update them about the activities of the GSSB. An example for that would be now, once we have approved occupational health and safety and water, when we launch the standards, we can actually reach out to some 50,000 people and inform them about the fact that there are new standards available. And we have been starting to experiment with this functionality, and what we see is over and above the regular newsletter of GRI and other means to reach out to our stakeholders, this has been a fairly effective tool in actually getting some traction for changes that we have to communicate. Historically, that has always been an issue. Very many practitioners, even 1 or 2 years after a change of our core product, were surprised when they discovered that there was a change. So we have to close that gap. And I think with what we're seeing, we've come a lot closer. At the moment, we're still adding at a rate of about 3,000 new contacts per month to the GI contact database. And just to give you a comparison, I think during G4 times that was in the range of 400 to 500 a month. So we have a lot more people, new people coming to GRI for various reasons, looking at the GRI standards. We will also have a look in a moment at what that translates to in terms of GRI standards reports, because that's probably an even more important question. But I wanted to start with this update on how much interest we see with stakeholders. I've also reported to you at various occasions on the work that we're doing around translations, which this has been a very significant portfolio for the standards division. Each of the translations is about a 6-month process, which is fairly involved, dealing with a translation agency on the one hand, then peer reviewers on the other, and of course also producing all these documents. We are now already looking at 9 languages and 37 documents each, actually even more than that, because we also have the combination of the standards. And we're really developing a portfolio of several hundred publications under management by the standards division. What's interesting to see is with the translation is whether or not we're able to open up new markets, have new audiences for our core product by translating our core product. And I think what I can report back that at least for 3 languages, we're clearly seeing activity around those translations. That is the Spanish translation, traditional Chinese, and Japanese has been very popular, I think, overall, and then also in historic comparison. We have a French translation, a German translation, and also a simplified Chinese translation, which will be added here. And we have statistics at the next meeting for you on that. But I think in particular the Spanish translation is one where we, can get in touch with new audiences, and we have also a fair share of reports that are issued in Spanish language only, and that is certainly enabled by having the Spanish translation. A similar observation can be made about Japanese based reports, and certainly also reports from China, although there is less activity than overall than in the Spanish-speaking countries. When you look at the total number of GRI standards reports, and this is really only about the standards reports, we have slightly more than 400 reports till end of January this year registered with GRI. And the important disclaimer is here, these are the reports that GRI is aware of at that moment in time. This is a combination of stakeholders informing us, data partners as we're calling them, helping us to get this information into our database by notifying us about reports, and also companies notifying us about the fact that they have issued a report. When you look at the distribution across the different options on how you can apply the standards, the core option is by far the most popular one, with more than 300 reports based on the core option. The comprehensive option is slightly above 60. And interestingly, the GRI reference reports are clearly the minority at the moment. We're not quite sure why that is. I think based on the GSB discussions at the time when the standards were approved, one hope and probably the underlying idea with the GRI reference reports was that we would enable more to reference GRI without actually taking an undue hurdle for the early reporting to apply it on the core level. But there seems to be still a dynamic that the preferred option is to go with core. What we will see probably this year is with a couple of the regulations globally kicking in, importantly the EU directive, that more GRI reference reports will emerge. So we expect that this number to go up. And I have an update in a minute also on our registration process for the reports that has changed. And we hope to provide more accurate data also over time that is more complete, importantly. When you look at the distribution of the types, I alluded already to the fact that the core option remains the most popular one. For the regional distribution, we see still Europe in the lead, with 42% of the reports coming out of Europe. This is, in the historic context of GRI, has always been the case, that Europe was the region where you had the first movers in transitioning to a new version of our core product. But I think it's fair to say here that we're seeing that Asia is becoming more and more important overall in terms of uptake of the GRI standards and the GRI core product. It used to be North America in the second region, and now it's Asia, and Asia keeps growing in terms of number of reports and also stakeholders to download. Evan.
Is the purple North America?
Yes, sorry, yeah, and it's glitch on the slide. Yes, 18%, yeah. So they're not far apart, and the US are still next to Taiwan, actually, the leading country in terms of uptake, but collectively as a region in Asia you have more reports now. So let me cover those standards projects on the next slide that are not going to be discussed in detail as part of an approval today. We have currently ongoing the project on tax and payments to government. Kent is the GSB sponsor for that project. We've had a first meeting with the technical committee. We had 2 virtual meetings in the lead up to that in-person meeting. And I think what I can report back at this stage to the GSB is that the experts feel comfortable that they can actually draft a standard. That was one of the questions that we had for them and that we wanted to inventorize in the first meetings, whether there was enough substance to that debate that we could actually move ahead with a proposal for standards. As you will appreciate, this topic is a highly political one, and I think from a standards division perspective, we are looking at a draft standard as something that probably will go for 2 public comments. First of all, it is not common practice to report on tax payments across the board, even with the leading reporters. Second, there is a lot of debate, and I think a lot of also different opinion about which are the relevant bits and pieces of information that should be in a public report about tax and payments to governments. And there is the societal perspective, there is certainly an investor perspective that goes beyond just financial materiality discussion. But on top of that, clearly also a very strong business perspective on this is not regulated in pretty much any market, so why would that be part of a voluntary reporting scheme? And to accommodate all these different perspectives in the process, we anticipate at the moment that around mid of the year we will be able to present you with a first draft, maybe the recommendation to go for public comment, but it will likely take 2 public comments until this standards can be approved, if it can be approved at some point. But we are positively surprised by the progress we've been making here. Certainly because there was a doubt whether stakeholder constituencies could come together to agree on a basic set of information that would be relevant to disclose in a voluntary setting. For the human rights related standards, in terms of process, we are basically at a similar stage. We had a virtual meeting, we had an in-person meeting, and this group of experts is working on recommendations for phase 1 of the project, which importantly looks at the alignment of the standards overall with the UN guiding principles, and as key parts of that, what generic human rights reporting should look like. What are the minimum expectations around disclosure on human rights impacts, and how this can be further standardized, but also how our current standards relate to the UN guiding principles in terms of terminology and concepts. We had a good meeting, a very engaged group here as well. The recommendations are in progress. We're drafting also a first set of disclosures for them that they're currently under review with the expert group, and we will continue the discussion. It remains to be seen how quickly we can arrive with them at a full set of recommendations and how detailed they will be. The disclosures, there will certainly be an opinion and a clear direction from the group eventually. When it comes to the issue of materiality, and importantly also that concept of salience that is handled in the human rights discussion nowadays, and the alignment, there's a range of opinions in the group. I think that's fair to say at the moment, and while we will probably be reflective of these perspectives, there is a question right now whether the group can settle for one approach to a report going forward, or one recommendation on how to reconcile the human rights related discussions and GRI contents. But that might result in a scenario where the GSB is actually looking at different perspectives and evaluating different perspectives for the next phase of the project. We're currently scheduled to come back to you also before the summer break with a more detailed update, but in terms of looking at full drafts and all of that, that's likely going to occur at the next in-person meeting, right? Dwight and Sulema are representing the GSB as GSB sponsors in that process. They were also available for the in-person meeting a couple of weeks ago here in Amsterdam. Is there anything that you want to add at this stage, or shall we keep that for the more detailed discussion? Okay, good. Moving on to the next, disclosures on waste. We have approved the project proposal as per due process, and we're currently recruiting members for that group. If you still have ideas who to reach out to, that's very much welcome. We are about to schedule interviews with specific organizations that have been suggested by you and others, and have been an outcome of the research activities. And this is currently on schedule as projected. We hope to start the activities, and that's really pending an approval of a full slate of members before the summer break, and then an in-person meeting after the summer break. For GRI spills and leaks standard, the next project on the list here, we have put this forward to the SC and GRI board for their review. We've collected their feedback, but we've not yet approved these projects in detail with you. We will do that at a later stage, probably mid-year. And what we want to achieve here is that basically when we move for public comment with the waste-related work, we could probably start the spills and leaks standard work, which is more focused in many ways, and will hopefully be able to stage that in a way that we can run these two processes in parallel. For the last one on the list, the GI economic category related standards, This is a portfolio project. Several standards are affected here, and this is the work that we have postponed when our Deputy Director, Chelsea Reinhardt, left the organization last summer, and we have, until now, not sufficient capacity to pick that work up again. So this is still on hold. We have no activity on this at the moment other than following discussions that pertain to this issue area and noting different organizations that are vocal about these issue areas, but there is no active recruitment going on at this stage. Are there any questions related to these projects? No. What I will do then is, on the level of the work program, we have a couple of activities that I would just briefly describe the status of. The first one that is clearly ongoing and we basically activated for the first time is the issuance of authoritative interpretations. We will approve the first two today, and this will be a mechanism to be quick to the market with corrections or clarifications going forward. And I think we are now at a stage where a significant number of reporters will use the GRI standards for the first time, where we have to watch this space very closely to be reacting to feedback that we have on the standards. But yeah, the first two will be issued after our discussions today. We provide on a regular basis technical input to programs, products, and services developed by GRI. An example for that is all the sessions that we had in the past months on updates on service development. But it goes beyond that. There are, of course, elements of communication around the different products and services, as well as the programmatic focus of GRI, where we give technical input on language and so on. Right now, this is not as busy as it used to be after the launch of the standards, but it's clearly picking up, and there is a lot of activity in the GRI Secretariat overall at the moment, which we will have to accommodate in the months to come. I did mention the translations already. This is currently more than one full-time equivalent of work for the team to keep these processes running. And in actual fact, this will continue because we are now, with 2 new standards, also translating again to very many languages, and to keep everything current. This will be a core part of our overall activities for years to come, probably, to maintain the standards in different languages. Last on the list of the ongoing activities is the GI standards report registration. We did inform you that we have now a technical solution for organizations to come to GI and upload their report in line with the requirements set out in the GI standards. I have to report after 1 month of existence of that tool that it is, while we're still observing some technical issues, I think, with the IT solutions, but we're working towards a version that is actually 100% in terms of providing the user with a really easy experience in terms of uploading information. The idea behind the tool is that it takes between 5 and 10 minutes for an organization to upload their report and notify GRI. And in the past, that was done through an email only, and actually very, very few organizations have used this. Since we have the requirement that you have to inform GI about GI report for it to be a GI report in the first place, or a GI standards report in the first place, this is a fairly important functionality, and we're going to focus also in the next week with the team to get this up and running. What we hope is that we can capture a lot of this transition activity which is occurring this year with organizations using the GI standards for the first time. Where we are working, I think, with limited time investment is a couple of the collaboration activities with external parties. We have one programmatic focus around participation in initiatives and projects to improve the quality of reporting. What I can report back here is that we continue to contribute to working groups set up by WBCSD around assurance and credibility mechanisms. As part of that overall effort, there is also an activity at the IAASB in New York, where they look at developing guidance for emerging forms of reporting, as they call it, which importantly includes sustainability reporting. And the chair of the GI board, Eric Hespenheid, is a member of the group and that is providing input into that process for the IAASB, and we are supporting him in that role. These are the main activities, I think, around quality of reporting that we are supporting right now. A lot more could be done, arguably, but it is really a resource constraint for us at the moment. We cannot allocate sufficient staff time to be participating in more processes. In terms of reduction of reporting burden and uptake of the GRI standards, we continue to make contributions to the work of other standard setters, as well as those that recommend certain set of metrics. But this is more on an ad hoc basis at the moment, where we give presentations, explain the GRI standards in context of other mechanisms. And I think the effort to actually integrate also other standard setters into our standards projects, that's something that I would mention under this heading. So the fact that SASB and CDP have importantly participated in the water-related project. Also with limited activity is the monitoring of the use of the GRI standards. And this is, again, an implication of the limited resources that we have available. Tamara, who has led the work on monitoring for the past years, has focused on getting the translations done. And she had very limited time to look at monitoring. We're refocusing her portfolio now, and I hope that we can pick up monitoring work in the months to come. In a more detailed way. We have concluded one pilot that we did with a university, the University of Arizona, to look at whether we can work with students to review reports and have a broader sample, basically, of reports on review on a yearly basis to draw conclusions for the GSB. And we're still in discussions on how we could scale these kind of efforts. But one of the main learnings is that it is actually quite time-consuming, if not almost prohibitive in terms of time by the standards division to educate those that review reports to get a proper quality established. So our expectations were probably a bit unrealistic in terms of how much we can additional help we can get from students that have a semester and a couple of hours per week to review reports. That's what we're finding. But we're scaling that, and Kent has offered his network and time to help us do that. So we will report back on these efforts when there's more to report. On hold at the moment out of the work program is one activity, and that's to develop new guidance for specific groups of reporters. We're not working on that at the moment. There was the idea whether there should be a work for SMEs specifically or other user groups maybe, and nothing has crystallized around that, and we haven't brought that back in form of a proposal to the GSSB in the last year. And that's I think in part, again, a resource constraint, but importantly also maybe not enough evidence that there is really a specific guidance needed for a subset of the reporters. And in that context, again, the SMEs. We just have too few SMEs at the moment that have used the GI standards and very, well, at best anecdotal feedback on that. There are programs underway where SMEs work with GI Secretariat to develop simple core reports, basically, and that might be a resource for us going forward to form an opinion whether there's additional specific guidance needed for small and medium-sized enterprises. Last but not least, as Judy has alluded to in the opening remarks, we have funding for the sector program, a budget allocation from the GRI Secretariat to do a pilot there, and we will pick that up later in a separate session, so I'm not going to spend time on this right now in detail. I'll leave it at that and hand back to Judy.
Questions for Bastian about general status of our work plan, our projects? Okay. Very good. Well, I think, thanks, Bastian. I mean, you do keep us well informed from month to month, so it's not surprising there's not a lot of discussion. Obviously, we're going to get into a lot more detail with a number of those things over the course of today and tomorrow. So we have picked up a little bit of extra time here, which is great, which means that we can move to, sorry, yes, right, yeah. We can move to session 1.3, which is item 2 in your pack of papers. This has to do with the status of definitions in the GRI standards. And this is for the FAQ that we publish on the standards website. I'm going to ask Laura to talk us through the discussion so far and help bring us to a conclusion on this.
Thank you, Judy. So item 2 includes a proposed FAQ response to clarify the status of definitions in the GRI standards, and this is presented for feedback and comments by the GSSB. And it does not require formal approval under due process. So the proposed FAQ clarifies that an organization preparing a report in accordance with the standards is required to apply the definitions in the GRI standards glossary, and that in principle, no omissions or deviations are permitted from those definitions, except in the case where a disclosure allows the use of reasons for omission. So in those cases, we have included an example for a disclosure covering a subset of workers to exemplify that in the scenario where a company only has data for its own employees, it could use a reason for omission to explain that situation. This FAQ has been discussed several times already by the GSSB over the last year, and the last time we discussed this with you, there was concern by one GSSB member that we hadn't done yet a thorough assessment of those definitions for which no reasons for omission would be permitted, to see if they would be feasible in all cases and fit for purpose. And there was also a request by the GSSB that we consult with ISO to understand if they do require the use of definitions in their standards. So regarding the ISO question, we did consult with them in the lead up to this meeting, and contrary to what we thought or what we found, they do not require the use of definitions in the ISO standards. The definitions simply clarify the terms used in the requirements, but they are not requirements per se in order to claim conformity to the ISO standards. Regarding the other question, we have compiled those definitions in the GRI standards glossary for disclosures that do not permit the use of reasons for omission, and you can find that in the annex of item 2. So these are the definitions which an organization would not be permitted to deviate from if preparing a report in accordance with the standards. The standards division has looked at the definitions, and there's no concerns from our perspective. These are either definitions for key terms, which the GSSB has already discussed at length during the transition to standards, or they are definitions for terms that have been revised recently as part of the employee and worker related terminology review, or they are so broad or general that they shouldn't really pose a problem for reporters. And in the lead up to this meeting, Kirsten Hovey, who had previously raised some concerns with the potential implications of this FAQ, has confirmed that she wouldn't have any problems with making these definitions mandatory, and that she would be fine with the FAQ response as it stands in item 2. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Judy, to see if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Laura. So to recap from our last discussion, Kirsten, who, as we say, is not here today to speak to it, but she has been engaged in the interim. She had a concern around whether or not there would be certain definitions that would end up being mandatory, but in fact unfeasible for some reporters. On examination, because of the status of reasons for omission, it has been determined to her satisfaction, as has been communicated back to the Standards Division, that that is no longer a concern on her part. So for those of you who recall the discussion the last time we were talking about this, that has been resolved as far as she is concerned. Now, that doesn't mean it's been resolved as far as the rest of you are concerned, so let's make sure that we have tested this enough. Do we have any discussion, questions, or comments at this point? Yeah, Nand Kumar.
Yeah, I think my understanding now goes that the definitions are not mandatory to be followed?
So the proposal on the table right now is that definitions in the standards will be mandatory. Okay. In the case where standards are subject to reasons for omission, then obviously the definitions attached to them are similarly subject to reasons for omission.
Fine,
yeah.
That's fine.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you. And Sulema.
I have a question about where a term is not defined at the glossary. The proposed solution, for me, it's a little bit confusing, because it's definitions that are commonly used and understood apply when there is no definition in the glossary. But it can be very confusing for people who, well, it's commonly used by whom or by what entity?
Thank you, Sulema. May I respond? This is already stated in the GRI standards glossary, and I believe the intention was to say that what a term is not defined in the GRI standards glossary, the common definition, as in that used in a regular dictionary, would apply. Or if it's not, then it would be up to the organization to define the term.
Maybe you should take advantage of this modification, the clarification, and state that. Thank you.
Any other discussion of this? So, Laura, what do you understand to be the action then? Will we be modifying the proposed text in response to that discussion?
Yeah, sure. So we would be modifying the line before last in the FAQ to say something along the lines of what a term is not defined in the glossary, definitions that are commonly used and understood apply, which means those definitions available in a dictionary, common dictionary, or where a term is not defined in dictionary. It is up to the reporting organization to define the term, and it is recommended that they state the definition that they have used for that term.
We have that language in the glossary already.
In the glossary, we only have the line that's stated here, so the additional explanation would need to be drafted.
Okay, okay. All right. Well, so then we have we have just a little bit of work to do to get the right form of wording. assuming we can do that, which I'm sure we can, I'd like to then move this to approval, which requires some due process.
No,
it
this one doesn't.
Doesn't, I beg your pardon, the next one does. Yeah, sorry. Right. So subject to the conversation that we've just been having to add a little bit of context around the second to last line here about what commonly used and understood definitions refers to. I will, subject to any further discussion or objections at this point, I will ask the Standards Division to complete that task, and then we will publish this in the FAQ, yeah? Are we? Okay, I see no objections around the table. Kent, are you on board with this? Hearing none. I don't know what's happened to Kent. Hopefully he hasn't fallen asleep. It is the middle of the night where he is. So at any rate, I'm sure there's just a technical problem. Anyway, thank you very much. He says it's great. Okay, good. Thank you, Kent. I appreciate it. Good. Okay, so next is also Laura is going to help us with this. This is items 3, 4, 5, and 6 in the handouts.
Okay, so next
this is the, so we have a few, we have standard interpretations. This is where we're going to have some due process. So at any rate, I'm going to ask Laura to talk us through these again, please.
Sure, thank you, Judy. So we have 2 standard interpretations to be approved as part of this session. And as you remember previously, we decided to combine several steps in the due process for this at this meeting. So we will first look to approve the final project proposal for each of those interpretations, and then the standard interpretation itself. So there are 4 approvals scheduled in total for this session: the approval of the project proposal and standard interpretation for making a GRI reference claim, and the approval of the project proposal and standard interpretation for disclosure 4011. So let's start with item 3 of the meeting papers, which is the final project proposal for issuing a standard interpretation for making a GRI reference claim. A draft version of this project proposal was previously approved by the GSSB earlier this year, and then the draft was circulated to the GRI board and the Stakeholder Council for comments as required under due process. No comments have been received from the board or the SC on the draft project proposal, so we've made no significant changes to the final project proposal compared to what the GSSB has seen already. So I think what's left to do is just see if there are any final comments or questions from the GSSB on the project proposal, and then move this through the approval vote of the GSSB.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, so again, these are documents that we have been over at various times in the past, so hopefully there aren't new issues to take up at this point. Do we have any discussion or questions for clarification or discussion at this point around this particular item 3, the final project proposal for developing a standard interpretation for making a GRI referenced claim? Hearing none, I think this is approved. Thank you very much to the Standards Division for leading us through this. Yeah, sir, yes, sorry, Sulema.
It's a quick question, it's approved. But I was thinking about the translation, the translated version of the standards. After approving and issuing this interpretation, how we will handle with the already translated versions?
We will handle it the same way as we handle it for the English version. We will have to flag up in the standards that there is an interpretation that pertains to a particular section. And we are in the process of developing the design for that, how that will look like. But it is important that we basically, whenever a user downloads a standard on the website, it is clear that interpretation pertains to that particular download, as well as if a person has downloaded already or receives a copy, that also in the actual document there is a mentioning of the fact that there are interpretations that pertain to a particular section. And that is the same way for, handled the same way for the English as well as all the language versions. And I think in that context I was also referring to the very many publications that are now under management, because this will have to be flagged up now in just a few standards. But you can imagine that there will be interpretations that actually need to be flagged up in each and every standard, potentially, right? And so that would be then implicating a reissue of very many individual documents.
Just a reminder that the English language standards and all documents are the authoritative versions under GRI, and therefore once things like these interpretations have been approved by the GSSB, they are in force regardless of the status of formal interpretations that may exist. But it's an important educational tool and responsibility in the context of the various languages of the standards. Laura, next.
Thank you. So next we're going to have a look at item 4, which is the proposed standard interpretation for making a GRI reference claim. And here I have singled out the interpretation statement, which is the core element of the interpretation. And the interpretation is clarifying that an organization making a GRI reference claim is not required to comply with clause 3.3.2 in GRI 101 Foundation, which asks organizations to comply with all reporting requirements that correspond to the disclosures reported. And as you might recall, this is based on feedback from the users of the standards who flagged that this clause was contradicting the purpose of the GRI reference claim, which is to report on specific standards or parts of a standard. So the interpretation clarifies that this is no longer required. If an organization reports partially on a disclosure, it would simply need to state which specific elements of the disclosure it has reported. And here there is an example of how that claim might be made. And at the end, there's also still a recommendation or an encouragement for organizations to report fully on all of the disclosures that they report on, but this would no longer be required with this interpretation. In developing the interpretation, we've consulted with some users of the GRI standards. We approached those who inquired or gave feedback about this clause, as well as organizations who had made a GRI reference claim. And a couple of respondents gave feedback, very positive feedback. They've said that the interpretation addresses the main concern with the GRI reference claim, and the verbatim comments received can be found in the annex of item 4, in case you would like to consult them. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Judy, to see if there are any questions or comments.
Thank you very much. As Laura said, the feedback received is summarized in the last page of the document. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Any further need for clarification on this issue? This fixes a problem in the original standard that was brought to our attention by some users. Yeah, Julia.
I just make a comment. I think this is really, given the EU directive, I think you mentioned that earlier, Besh, and I think this is a really important thing and just something to flag. I'd be curious in the months ahead, maybe at our next meeting, if there's any tracking that we're doing around this as well, just to see if this is growing over the coming months and years.
Oh, pardon me, thank you. Any further, any further discussion or questions? Okay, no debate then. Right, Kent. Anything to add to this discussion, Kent? Okay, right. So here we have some due process.
Shall I go through that and explain?
Yes?
Yeah?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Maybe what I do now is to explain just what is laid out in the due process as the steps that we need to move through, and then Judy will take over when we actually do the approval. So there are 2 steps that are required for standards interpretations at this stage. It's me as the head of the standards division to advise whether the due process has been followed. And then the chair Judy calling for a vote for approval of the standard interpretation. And importantly, these kind of approvals require an 80% slate of the GSSB. So actually, the membership that is in the room is needed to approve the interpretations. And we have the added benefit of our telephone participant, Kent. So we let's hope that we can get this done. Now, if we can move to the next slide. There is, in terms of sequence, we have already looked at whether there are other issues that need to be discussed in relation to the interpretation. The next step now is for Judy to ask about whether due process has been met, and then we will call for a vote, and this is the scripted text that Judy has been referring to already, so that we are in line with the due process expectation. Yep.
So, Bastian, I'd like to ask the head of standards, what is your view on whether due process has been met on the development of this standard interpretation?
Yeah. So the standard has moved through all the required steps for standards interpretation. So project identification, prioritization, the project commencement, the development of proposed standard interpretation. And we had also an opportunity for the GRI board and the stakeholder council to issue an opinion on this for the benefit of the GSSB. And we are now arriving at the approval point for this interpretation. And in our perspective, we have met all due process requirements up till now. And what remains is really the approval and release of the final interpretation.
Thank you very much. Therefore, can I ask those in the room to raise their hand if they agree that this standard interpretation should be issued and approved? And separately, I'm going to ask Kent on the telephone to voice his approval if he agrees.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. We heard you. So that
definitely I approve.
Thank you, Kent. So this is approved and will be released as such as a standard interpretation. Thank you very much for that. So moving right along.
Thank you, excellent. Just one thing that I forgot to mention is that different from the GRI standards, the effective date of standard interpretations will be the date of the launch. So they will become effective, meaning organizations can use that as of the date of the launch of the interpretations. And the launch for this and the other interpretation will coincide with the launch of the revised water and occupational health and safety standards, just for the record. Okay, so next we're going to move to the standard interpretation for disclosure 4011, which is a disclosure on the rates of employee turnover and new employee hires. We're looking at item 5 first, which is the final GSSB project proposal for developing an interpretation for disclosure 4011. Similarly, as with the previous interpretation, a draft project proposal was circulated to the GRI board and the stakeholder council for comments after the approval of the GSSB. No comments have been received from the board or the SC, and as a result, no significant changes have been made to the final proposal compared to what the GSSB has seen previously. So with that, I will just turn it over to Judy to see if there are any questions, comments, and then move to the approval of the project proposal.
Thank you very much. Any questions or comments on this project proposal? Okay, well then we'll move to approval. Can I ask those in the room to raise their hand if they agree to approve the project proposal in this standard interpretation? Okay, and separately, Kent, I will ask you to voice your approval to this project proposal if you indeed agree.
Yes, I definitely approve. And don't worry, I've had 3 cups of coffee, so I'm wide awake.
Excellent. Glad to hear it. Very good. Okay, so this project proposal, item 5, is approved.
Thank you. So next, we're moving to item 6. The proposed standard interpretation for disclosure 4011. Again, as with the previous interpretation, I've put up the interpretation statement up on the screen for you to look at. This standard interpretation clarifies that an organization is not required to comply with clause 2.1 in GRI 401 employment, which requires organizations to use the total employee numbers at the end of the reporting period to calculate the rates of new employee hires and employee turnover. And this is based on feedback from the users of the GRI standards who said that the required methodology is incorrect and that these rates should be calculated by either using the number of employees at the beginning of the period or the average number of employees throughout the period. To validate this proposal, the Standards Division, together with some GSSB members, we did some research and consultation on existing methodologies for calculating the rates. And you find in the annex of item 6 the list of methodologies that we consulted in this process. And in a nutshell, what we found is that none of these methodologies use the number of employees at the end of the reporting period to calculate the rates. And what we also found is that there is no one methodology that is widely used or recognized for calculating the rates. There are a variety of methodologies and approaches used in different contexts. And that's why you see that we're not proposing an alternative methodology for calculating the rates. We're simply stating that the organization is free to choose the methodology it wishes to calculate the rates. And then we've included a reference to a recommendation in GRI 101 Foundation, which recommends that whenever the basis of measurement or calculation is not apparent, the organization should explain that in the report, and that when using ratios or normalized data, the organization should provide the absolute data used in calculating those rates, as well as any explanatory notes needed. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Any further discussion of this interpretation statement? Okay, hearing none, I will then turn to the head of standards to ask Bastian, what is your view on whether due process has been met on the development of this standard interpretation?
So in short, In short, the Standards Division is of the opinion that due process has been met. Similar to the earlier standard interpretation for approval, we have moved to the steps of project identification and prioritization, commencement, development of proposed standard interpretation, and the GI Board and Stakeholder Council had an opportunity to comment. And again, from our perspective, we have followed due process up till now.
Thank you very much. Can I ask those in the room to raise their hand if you agree with this standard interpretation to be finalized? Thank you. And Kent, I will ask you to voice your approval if you agree.
I approve.
Thank you. Okay, it's approved. Thank you very much, Laura. That's excellent.
Lunch break? No, not
No,
yet.
we're not on our lunch break yet. I think what we will do, maybe it's even a little bit early, but shall we take a break? Or shall we just move to the next?
Can I say that we missed the approval of the summary at the beginning, of the summary of the meeting of 22nd March?
Okay, we don't vote on that unless there are objections to it. It's by
normally, yeah,
shall we rerun that then if required, if it needs to go into the record?
I think it's fine for what we had on record. That's the way we've approved it. Yeah. Okay. In the past.
All right. Fine.
I think we can take a 15-minute break now, or we actually take up the standard now.
How do members feel? Would you like to steel yourselves for the OH&S discussion? I mean, it's actually not a difficult discussion, this one. Should we get it over with and then take a break after that? Move on for half an hour? Okay, right. So for the benefit of Kent not in the room and for the benefit of anybody else listening in, we are going ahead to session 1.5 to look at GRI 403. This is items 10 and 11 in the handouts. And Laura, you are still going to help us at this point, are you not?
Sure, thank you. So there are three schedule approvals by the GSSB for this session. The first one is to approve the revised GRI 403 Occupational Health and Safety Standard with an effective date of 1st of January 2021, and we will explain the rationale for the proposed effective date later in this presentation. To approve whether a re-exposure of the revised standard is needed or not at this stage. And finally, to approve the withdrawal of the previous standard, GRI 403 Occupational Health and Safety from 2016, by the start of the effective date of the revised standard, which would be the 31st of December of 2020. So, as you recall, over the last few months, we have given the GSSB regular updates on the working group discussions and their proposed changes to the standard following the public comment period. We've given detailed overviews of how the standard has been evolving over the last few months. So we will not go into detail for all of the changes that have been made since the public comment period. You have those summarized in detail at the beginning of item 10. And we have also presented to you item 11, which is the draft basis for conclusions for GRI 403, which summarizes the significant issues raised during public comment and how those have been responded to in the final standard. So if there are any questions or comments on any of the changes summarized in item 10 and 11, I'm happy to respond to those. But what I would like to do in the next few minutes is to simply present the final contents in the revised GRI 403 standard and to highlight some of the key features in this standard. So GRI 403 includes three main sections. The first section outlines the scope of workers covered by GRI 403. This is based on work previously done as part of the employee and worker-related terminology review. And the working group has expanded these, added more guidance, as well as examples. And we will have a look at the different categories of workers included within the scope in a moment. The second section contains the management approach disclosures, where in addition to the disclosures in GRI 103 management approach, the working group has developed specific content for reporting on the management of occupational health and safety. And then we have 3 topic-specific disclosures looking at different elements of performance and impacts. The first disclosure, disclosure 403.1, looks at the extent to which workers are covered by an occupational health and safety management system. Disclosure 403.2 looks at work-related injuries and related hazards. And disclosure 403.3 looks at work-related ill health and related hazards. The first disclosure is a new disclosure compared to the previous version of the standard. And the contents of disclosure 403.2 and 403.3 is to a large extent based on previous content in the 2016 standard, but that has been significantly revised during this process. So in terms of the key features that we would like to highlight to you, first is the new section on scope of workers. There are 3 main categories of workers for whom an organization is responsible for their occupational health and safety and who need to be covered when reporting against this standard. The first category are employees, and all employees need to be covered regardless of the degree of control of their work or workplace. The second category are workers who are not employees, but whose work or workplace is controlled by the organization. And for these 2 categories, employees and control of work and workplace, an organization would be required to report extensively for all of those workers on all of the management approach requirements and the topic-specific disclosures. And the third category are cases where an organization is directly linked to occupational health and safety impacts via business relationships. And in those instances, the organization would only be required to report on how it prevents and mitigates those impacts and the hazards identified. The next feature is the new management approach specific content. This focuses on the presence of a management system for occupational health and safety based on either legal requirements or recognized standards or guidelines. And then it goes on to describing the key components of that management system, such as the process to identify hazards, processes for worker consultation, participation, training, etc. And all of those components are largely based on the standards of the ILO and the newly launched standard of the ISO for occupational health and safety. You will see that there's a greater emphasis on the identification of hazards and assessment of risks and the application of the hierarchy of controls to eliminate and control hazards. And that comes across throughout the standard, both in the management approach section as well as in some of the topic-specific disclosures. And this is a key expectation for all of the workers included in the scope of the standard. You will also see a greater emphasis on measuring impacts on the health and safety of workers as opposed to measuring the loss of productivity for the organization, which is quite common in this field. So this is now more in line with the purpose of the GRI standards, which is to look at the impacts on people and contribution to sustainable development. So to give you an example, when looking at the severity of an injury or ill health, this is measured in the standard by looking at recovery time, so how long it takes for the worker to recover to pre-injury health status, as opposed to looking at how much or how long it takes for the worker to come back to work, which in many cases, a worker might come back to work before he or she has fully recovered from a work-related injury or illness. And finally, the standard takes a holistic approach to health and safety. It covers both the prevention of harm which is still the primary focus of the standard and the primary responsibility of an organization, but it also covers aspects of promotion of worker health and access to healthcare. And this is very much aligned with the priorities introduced in the Sustainable Development Goals around health. So that's in a nutshell the key features of the revised GRI 403 standard. As mentioned earlier, the Standards Division is proposing an effective date for this standard of 1st of January of 2021. And this is also being proposed for the revised GRI 303 Water and Effluents standard. With this proposed effective date, we are giving at least a year and a half to those organizations who will be publishing their 2020 report in early 2021 to implement the data collection systems to report against the standard. So at least there will be a year and a half to implement those systems, if not more, depending on the date when the organization publishes the report. And this also takes into account the fact that many organizations will now be transitioning from the G4 guidelines to the GRI standards. And that's why the slightly longer transition period for these two standards. And finally, you may have seen in item 10 that there is an additional set of recommendations from the working group to the GSSB. So this is separate from the standard itself, and these are recommendations for the consideration of the GSSB as it discusses its work program for the next few years. So during the development of the standard, there was a lot of discussion within the group as to the scope of workers and who should be covered as part of the standard. And in the final deliberations, the working group recommended that only those persons who perform work for the organization should be covered within the standard. And that means that injuries or illnesses involving members of the public as a result of a work-related incident would be excluded, as well as persons working in a workplace owned by the organization, but who do not perform work for it. So that's mainly those organizations in the business of leasing offices or workplaces. They wouldn't be required to report on injuries or ill health for those persons working in the places that they own if those persons are not performing work for the organization itself. And the rationale is that these elements have more to do with public safety or customer health and safety than occupational health and safety. Nevertheless, the working group wanted to ensure that these cases are still adequately covered within the GRI standards, because there is still a responsibility by the organization to for any injuries or illnesses involving any of these persons. So the working group would like to recommend to the GSSB that standards for public and customer health and safety be revised or developed to ensure that these cases are adequately covered in the standards.
And maybe just to add to that, so this is a discussion we will bring up tomorrow with the work program. Again, because it is similar to what we've seen with the effluents and waste standards, a follow-up on a project that we're completing.
So that's it. So I'll turn it over to you to see if there are any comments or questions on either item 10 or item 11. And just to note that item 11 is still in draft form. The basis for conclusions will be finalized after the approval of the GSSB, and they don't need to be approved formally by the GSSB.
Right, right. Right, good. Thank you very much, Laura. So the draft basis for conclusions is a document that is required to be produced in order to inform our deliberation at this point around approval of this draft standard. It summarizes essentially what came through in the discussion, what were the findings of the research and the consultation that led to the standard being drafted the way that it has been. We can still add to it at this point, as Laura Laura says, this is not a document itself that needs to be approved. It is one that needs to be referred to by us in kind of thinking about whether or not we agree to approve the draft GRI 403. Michel, I see you're raising your badge. Does that...
No, I just wanted to emphasize that standards will need to be updated because definitions like recordable accidents or there is another one which is, I don't know if it's high severity accidents or something like that, which are referred to in the draft. Those are not standard definitions in Europe. They may be in the United States, but they're not in Europe, and so the standards will absolutely need to be updated if we want to enforce this.
Is it the standards that have to be updated or the glossary?
The glossary will need to be updated.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I just ask the Standards Division to take note of that comment? Yeah, I mean, I think probably alongside the recommendations from the working group as to, that we saw on the previous slide, which we'll talk about tomorrow when we get to the work plan, yeah?
Yeah, but I think there's also a response we can give.
Okay, fine.
Yeah, so the terms and definitions included in item 10 are presented for approval as a package together with the standards. So if there are any concerns with those definitions, that would need to be discussed during this session. So the definition of recordable work-related injury, recordable work-related injury or ill health, that's based on the methodology from the US OSHA administration. And the second definition that you were referring to is that the high consequence injury, exactly. So this one was drafted by the working group. It is not based on a specific instrument or legislation. It's just a way of identifying which of the injuries reported would be considered to be severe based on the threshold included in this definition, and it's in replacement to currently used methodologies that look at lost time. Again, with this effort in mind of looking at the impacts on workers' health as opposed to the loss of productivity. So for this one in particular, we didn't have a point of reference because it was developed specifically for this standard, for this particular purpose.
No, my comments was that in the document presented, those words are underlined, meaning that there is a link to the glossary, and currently it's not in the glossary.
Which terms would those be?
The two that I refer to, recordable accidents.
They are in the glossary?
Not in the published one.
In the existing one?
Yes.
No. Oh, okay. Of course. So everything in this paper will replace the existing standard, 2016, plus the definitions in the glossary for those terms. Yes, sorry.
Thank you. I think that was a helpful clarification. Okay. Nankumar, yes.
Sorry, I'm just flagging this once again. This recovery time could be a little difficult to record because you never know after a serious accident when he never fully recovers. So he partially recovers and comes back for work. So how are we going to record the recovery time? Thank you.
So in that case, if a worker does not recover, then that would be counted as part of the number and rate of high consequence injuries. The exact recovery time doesn't need to be measured or reported. As soon as a worker does not recover or cannot recover or is not expected to recover within 6 months, then that injury gets classified as a high consequence injury and needs to report it separately. But there wouldn't be a requirement necessarily to measure the specific length of the recovery time, nor to report on it separately. It's just a way of classifying injuries according to severity.
Any other questions or discussion? Robin.
Yeah, I just had a question about looking at some of the feedback from the consultation, and in some areas the paper reads that one respondent raised an issue, sometimes it's a few respondents raised an issue, and for a couple of areas it's many respondents. So it appears from that the ones that got many respondents was around the scope and the boundary in terms of the term worker. And I guess I was just wanting to check that that's, my understanding is correct, that seems to be the area in terms of either injury or illness that most respondents have reflected that they would struggle with, at least early on, in terms of applying this. So if I've understood that correctly. And secondly, if I suppose this is from heavier and extractive industries where they've got joint ventures and contractors, and they don't necessarily report to that sort of level of detail on worker, that perhaps this will take several reporting cycles for them to expand on that and collect the data. And my third point would be around some sort of discussion around what sort of capacity building we might do in the fullness of time to communicate the changes and also help organisations start servicing this a bit better. So, sorry, 3 questions in one.
So regarding the first question, yes, those themes that were raised by many respondents are those related to the clarity of the scope of workers and the feasibility of reporting data on injuries and illnesses for the full set of workers in that scope. As you can see, we've done quite a lot of effort to clarify the scope of workers in the final standard, and the feasibility question has been discussed at length by the working group. Then they've acknowledged that that is a difficulty, especially for certain types of worker, where there is a lesser degree of control, as well as for reporting illnesses. But the conclusion was that the standard should not be lowered just because of the difficulty in gathering the data. The expectation would still apply that the information is provided, or that the organization makes an effort to collect that data and to take action. So what we did in response to those comments, we've included more guidance on cases where an organization may not be able to collect certain data, where there might be provisions, legal restrictions to report certain data or to give that data to a third party. And then every disclosure now contains a specific requirement for organizations to state if any workers have been excluded from the disclosure and why. So there's always a way for an organization to just be transparent about what's been possible to obtain and what's not been possible to obtain, but the expectation is still that that's what an organization should strive to achieve. Yeah. Regarding the second question, we did get feedback from companies in the extractives. It was very much along the lines of other feedback received from other stakeholder groups. And the specific question was around the time that it might take to implement. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just sort of acknowledging, I guess, that especially for some of those that have raised issues about how they treat joint ventures and contractors, that this may take a number of reporting cycles for them to actually start to service this in a more meaningful way. Yeah.
Exactly. And then regarding the third question, we are working on a number of approaches to raise awareness, explain the changes, and build capacity. One of them will be explained tomorrow, I believe, which is the development of case studies on the two revised standards. And one of the elements of that case study might be on data collection systems or ways to collect data from suppliers or other business partners to be able to comply with the requirements here.
And maybe just to add to that, I think there's a broader theme that we see with the new standards, but it has been a reoccurring discussion for GRI, and that relates to getting that notion out that reporting is always a journey and is always reflective of an ambition in terms of the disclosure that you eventually want to be able to respond to. But it should give the opportunity to reporting organizations to just reflect on the status quo, which means sometimes when they start to acknowledge as part of their GRI reporting that there is an impact, they don't even have an idea on how to collect data to start with, right? And it is perfectly fine, and it's encouraged by the standards as the way they're set out with the management approach, that we move from acknowledgement of an issue to an articulation of how the organization wants to deal with an issue, to move then into target setting around how you want to address the issue, but importantly also get a better, maybe where possible, quantitative handle on what is happening on the ground and developing this data. And that element keeps coming back for us. Many organizations look at the GRI standards still as a compliance exercise where you either comply fully or you don't, while that was never the spirit of the exercise to start with. And if there is capacity building to be done, it is also in that space to say that there are probably, and that's reflective of this specific discussion of occupational health and safety for sure, but many of the other discussions we have with experts, across the different constituencies, nobody expects that a multinational has a full overview of all the detail of all the workers with the scope and depth of the definition that we currently have the standards, but that there is a responsibility that exists, and we should work towards understanding the impacts on workers in that broad definition. That's the reality, and that's acknowledged by experts. And it is in that space where we need to do more around raising awareness for reporting really as a journey towards having complete disclosure and assuming responsibility, but you shouldn't stop with this effort just because in the beginning you don't have full information available, because that's probably, it's always a moving target to arrive at the point that you have full information.
Any further discussion or questions on this standard? Evan.
I'm always looking at these with an eye on the investment community. I was a little concerned that there were no investment constituents in the public comment period. Is that unusual? Is that a concern that we have no public comments from the investment constituency on this standard?
Thank you. It's not unusual. It's always one of the constituencies that it's harder for us to engage with. We did have one representative from the investment community as part of the working group. The person represents Sustainalytics, and they've provided ongoing feedback on ensuring that this information is also relevant for investor decision making. So from our perspective, we're happy that we've got that perspective, but we acknowledge that could have been more than that. Yeah.
And maybe to add to that, I think in part that is certainly a challenge that we have to overcome going forward. We have to engage this community better, but it is also reflective in many ways. That's what we find in the discussions of the current approach of investors to these type of subject matters. They are very focused right now not on the impact on workers. They are focused on the traditional measures of financial impact to the company. And the expertise, I think, is building up in that constituency to look more holistically at these implications. Water is a similar debate. And we're yet to see experts coming forward from the constituency that have taken that holistic view. They exist, but they're oftentimes very busy because they are the ones that are driving the ESG agenda, extending the ESG agenda within the constituency, and they don't necessarily have the time to join an involved process. But there is something where we have to connect these discussions, and I think ideas on how to have a more structured feedback process with those specific audiences, that's something we should be taking on board for certainly the upcoming projects on human rights and waste and so on. So maybe just as additional information on that.
Anything else? Okay, well, thank you, Laura, for that. That means that we move then into due process discussion. Bastian, may I ask you, what is your view on whether the due process has been followed with regard to the development of this proposed standard?
Thank you, Judy. And so the due process for standards is more involved. We have a couple of more steps to go through, so I will reflect on all of those. We have the project identification and prioritization, the project commencement, the appointment of the project working group, and the development of a proposed standard, interaction with the GRI board and stakeholder council along the way. Importantly at the beginning, to check the project scope with them, get their ideas. Also, we invited specifically here recommendations for working group representation, and we've reported repeatedly back to those governance bodies on the status of the project. But I think I would single out as the most important distinguishing factor is really the public exposure and the subsequent consideration of respondents' comments. For this particular standard, we have received extensive feedback, which is reflected in the draft basis for conclusion. And it is of a nature that has certainly led to changes of the standard, but we were, I think, at all stages of the process comfortable that the changes were not significant in the sense that they will require re-exposure, which is one of the next upcoming questions. But for the due process being met up till now, we at the Standards Division are comfortable that we have lived up to the expectations set out in the due process.
Thank you very much. Can I ask those in the room to raise their hand if they agree that this standard should be approved with an effective date of the 1st of January 2021? Okay. And Kent, may I ask you to voice your approval if you agree? He may have gone out for coffee.
I agree.
You agree. Excellent. Glad to hear it, Kent. Thank you. Okay, so the next piece of this, Bastian, are there any significant changes between the exposure draft and the final approved standard that require re-exposure?
As alluded to earlier, we don't see any significant changes that would require re-exposure at this point. And I think the experts were also comfortable with the changes based on the public consultation feedback that they've implemented, that they were improving the disclosure set out, but not fundamentally changing them in a way that another public consultation is needed.
Thank you. Okay, can I ask those in the room to raise their hand if they agree that this standard should be issued as final without re-exposure? And Kent, may I ask you to voice your agreement with that if you agree?
I agree.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. And the final piece of due process that we have to do now is to agree to withdraw the 2016 standard. Can I ask those in the room to raise their hand if they agree to withdraw the 2016 version of GRI 403 Occupational Health and Safety 2016 by the 31st of December 2020? Kent, may I ask for your voice approval?
I approve.
Thank you. Okay, well that then concludes the work of on GRI 403, and I think I'd like to just take a brief moment to, on behalf of the GSSB, to express our gratitude and appreciation to everybody who helped to contribute to this standard, most especially the members of the working group, those who provided comments during the public comment period, and to the Standards Division once again for leading us through the first of what will certainly be many to come, updates to standards and issuance of new standards. Thank you very much for all of that. I think that means we can go to a break now. Before we do, there was one thing that I forgot to mention, which, just for the benefit of anybody listening in the building that we're in right now, there is due to be a fire alarm test at some point in the afternoon, sometime between 12 o'clock and 3 o'clock. There is a chance it could be quite involved. We won't have to evacuate the building, but the alarm could be sounding for a period of time. There could be firefighters who come in and check to make, if it is a serious sort of drill, then we may. The point of this is that we may need to pause the recording for a period during the afternoon, and we'll just ask for your forbearance if you're listening in, if that comes to pass.
15-minute break and then reconvening at 11.
Yes, 15-minute break now, and if we can reconvene at 11 o'clock. According to my watch, it's exactly 11:15, so we'll go by that. Okay, thank you.